Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is The Odyssey by Homer. Now, The Odyssey is an epic poem believed to have first been written down sometime in the 8th century BC, making this the oldest book that I've reviewed on this channel so far. Even though this is a slightly modern translation of it, this is actually the George Herbert Palmer English translation, which was first published in 1921. Now, The Odyssey is actually a sequel to another epic poem attributed to Homer called the Iliad, which means that I probably should have read that one before reading this one, but from what I understand, you can easily read the Odyssey without having to read the Iliad. Now, it's interesting to note that there's actually a lot of debate about whether or not Homer actually set these poems down in writing, because according to legend, Homer was blind, which makes it unlikely that he was actually the one who wrote these poems down. From what I understand, these poems originated from the oral tradition, because Homer was a barb. Now, a barb, and believe me, I'm no expert on this, but I believe a barb in ancient Greece was a professional storyteller, somebody who would sing or recite poems and stories to an audience. It's also interesting to note that today, there's actually a lot of debate about whether or not Homer even existed, and I think that's really interesting how the credited author of these poems might be just as much of a legend as the characters within them. Also, from what I understand, a lot of what we know, or what we think we know about the Trojan War, actually came from these poems, because so much about the Trojan War is rooted in mythology, and there actually has been some debate about whether or not the Trojan War even happened, or if it's just a legend. I think today a lot of historians do think it did happen, but it most likely didn't happen the way the legends say it happened, and there's also a lot of debate on where Troy actually was. I think now it's been determined, or at least it's been theorized, that Troy was most likely in what is now modern-day Turkey. And that's the fascinating thing about ancient history, and believe me when I say that even though I do have an interest in history, by no means am I an expert or am I a historian by any means, but the thing about ancient history is in a lot of cases it seems like actual history and legend kind of become blurred. Like, was there actually an Achilles? Was there actually a Helen? Was there actually an Odysseus? Or are they just legendary figures? It's the same thing with, granted, this has nothing to do with Greek mythology or Greek history, but the whole story of Lady Godiva. We know Lady Godiva existed, but did that famous horse ride actually take place? Most historians, from what I understand, kind of agree that, yeah, that story was bullshit. Now, what the plot of the Odyssey is, it's set 10 years after the end of the Trojan War, and it's been 20 years since Odysseus has been to his homeland of Ithaca, because the Trojan War itself lasted 10 years. So now a lot of people assume that Odysseus is dead, and you have all these suitors who are trying to court his wife Penelope, something that you get the idea she really doesn't have a say in. But hers and Odysseus' son Telemachus, who's now a young man and hasn't seen his father since he was a child, is not too happy about this, and he's still holding out hope that Odysseus might still be alive. But in the story we learn that Odysseus is being held captive on this island by the goddess Calypso. So the goddess Athena takes pity on Odysseus and his family, and she convinces her father Zeus to finally let Odysseus return home. So Calypso is ultimately told to free Odysseus, and he begins his journey home, and he meets these people, and then he tells them how he ended up in this situation to begin with, and in this section of the book we get a story within the story, and this is where we actually get the story of the Odyssey, the story of him and his men journeying home after the Trojan War. And in this section of the book we learn that a lot of the tragedy that befell Odysseus and his men was kind of his own damn fault. And then finally he makes it home to Ithaca, and Athena disguises him as a beggar, and this is where he plans a grisly revenge against the suitors. Now, the Odyssey, whether you like the story or not, is one of the most important stories in history, and in a lot of ways, so much of modern-day storytelling really does owe something to the Odyssey. Like, you could argue that this was the original adventure story, that this was the original fantasy novel, even though I'm pretty sure the Epic of Gilgamesh does predate this. And there are so many tropes in here that are still being used in storytelling today, like the whole non-linear narrative and the whole story within the story trope, and there are also some literal Deus Ex Machinas in here where the gods, particularly Athena and Poseidon, intervene in Odysseus' journey. Now, I'm not saying those tropes originated with this story, but it's funny how we think of those as almost more modern-day tropes, and yet here's a story that was literally written centuries before Christ was even born that uses these tropes. But the Odyssey is an excellent piece of literature, but I'll admit it's not the easiest book to read, depending on which translation you read, because even though there are a lot of English translations of the Odyssey out there, a lot of them are sort of written in Old English, so if you are going to read the Odyssey, which I think you should, maybe you'll be better off reading one that's translated more to modern English, which I know there are some out there. But it's a really good adventure story, and it's a really good fantasy story, and there's a reason this story has stood the test of time the way it has. Now, there are a lot of themes in this story about homecoming and the importance of loyalty and hospitality, but a theme that I really saw in this story is arrogance and hubris, because so much of what happens to Odysseus is his own fault because he's so arrogant. Like, so much of the hardships that Odysseus faces is because he angers Poseidon when he blinds the Cyclops, Polyphemus? I'm probably butchering the Cyclops' name, but then in his arrogance he cries out, "Hey, when Poseidon asks you how you lost your sight, tell him it was Odysseus!" And ultimately, the downfall of Odysseus and his men is because of their own arrogance and their own hubris, and so much of the story is really about Odysseus having to learn from his mistakes and learn humility. And Odysseus is a complex character in the sense that he's not always the most likable character. In fact, there are points where he can be a real dick, even by the end of the story. And I understand the ancient Greeks had a very different view of what makes a hero than people today, but today Odysseus would probably be labeled more of an anti-hero. And the way he punishes the suitors at the end of the story is actually really cruel. Granted, some of them kind of had it coming, because a lot of them were already planning on assassinating Telemachus, his son, so a lot of them were evil men, but the book does imply that some of the suitors might actually be good men, but Odysseus basically says, yeah, some of you might be good people, but fuck them. And then he has these slave maids who he feels were disloyal to his family executed, and I'm thinking maybe the reason they were disloyal is because they didn't want to be freaking slaves, but I understand this is a story that's literally thousands of years old, so society back then had very different standards. You could also argue that there is some sexism in the book, because Odysseus expects his wife Penelope to be faithful to him the whole time, and she is, yet you see him sleeping around with all these goddesses in the story. Now, you could argue that that makes Penelope the better person and the better character, but it's almost like the poem is saying that, well, men can do it, but women can't. But that's a double standard that clearly existed back then, and unfortunately still exists today. The story also has some horror elements as well. Like, there's some horrific and even creepy scenes in this book. Like the scene where Odysseus and his men are trapped by the Cyclops. The Cyclops actually eats a lot of his men, and it describes it in really gory detail, and it's actually like a scene out of a straight horror story. There's also a scene where Odysseus has to go to Hades, and that's a pretty creepy scene as well, but it's also a really sad scene too, because he encounters his mother in Hades, who at that point he didn't even realize was dead. But yeah, I do recommend the Odyssey, especially if you have an interest in Greek mythology and Greek literature, and also if you appreciate classic literature, you should definitely read this at least once. Now I want to cut to my friend Christian Feliciano, who's a regular guest in my videos, giving his thoughts on the Odyssey, and when it cuts back to me, I'm going to be talking about the Odyssey's influence on modern pop culture and some of the adaptations.
I remember reading the Odyssey when I was a kid, and I thought at first, right before I opened it, I was like, this is going to be a boring book. It's one of the old, long texts that they, make you read in school, and it's going to be boring, and it's going to be, it's going to be a chore. It's not really going to be entertaining at all. And luckily, I was wrong. I loved the Odyssey when I read it the first time, and I've read it many times since, and I've loved it every time. It is one of the greatest stories ever. It's one of the most entertaining. It's one of the most fun. It doesn't read like an old text. I mean, yes, it does because of, the archaic language and everything, but in truth, it's just really, really fun to read. And once you get the hang of it, and once you realize that you're reading an epic poem from back in the day, it is very entertaining. It moves really swiftly. It's very action-packed. You're going to have really great scenes when you read it. It has really great monster scenes where Odysseus and his people are fighting these, monsters, whether it's the Cyclops, whether it's the Scylla, I believe it's called, whether it's, the Sirens. I mean, he's not fighting the Sirens, but you know what I mean. There's these great creatures that are very fascinating, and you learn a lot about what the Greeks believed at that time, or what they taught people about that time, based on what you read in the Odyssey. For example, the Sirens, when you meet the Sirens, there was a place at that time where they would hear these noises and wonder what it was. And yes, nowadays they speculate what that could have been based on the area it was in. They say that it was probably just echoes off of whatever animals were there at that time. They would just, the echoes would just bounce off the rocks and scare the hell out of the sailors. But you learn that these people, were using real life inspirations for these creatures, and it just makes you want to research more to learn. Once you learn that, you want to just research more to learn what else could have been inspired by truth. What else could have been inspired by real life, or what the Greeks saw at that time. And it's really fun. The story-wise, it's, like I said, it moves pretty quickly. It is interesting that the whole story is about Odysseus trying to get back home. And the problem is that he goes and makes the biggest mistake you can ever make, which is that he pisses off the sea god. Now, if you know anything about ancient people, everybody sailed home. That's the way you travel through the earth. Nobody flew, nobody, they would go on land sometimes, but a lot of these places, to get to a lot of these places, you had to sail. And of course, he pisses off the sea god by attacking his son, the Cyclops. And now he can't get the hell home because the sea god, Poseidon, put a curse on him. I know that people like to say that Odysseus is very smart, he's intelligent, all stuff. But when you make a mistake like that, it makes me question whether he really was smart or whether he was just a fucking idiot. And, that could be debated, but in my opinion, I think he was just an idiot. His men are even worse, and I won't spoil why, but they do something stupid later on, which, you're going to see them get their just desserts, and you're like, hey, what are you going to do? The character of Odysseus is very, very sympathetic. You do feel bad for him. You do feel like, damn, you want this guy to get home, because his wife, on the other hand, she's waiting around for him, and if she thinks he's dead, she can't stay around waiting for him forever, or have to move on and marry somebody else. And of course, his son, doesn't want a stepfather, so of course he wants his father to come home, and he's being told that his father's alive, that she gotta wait for him, but time is running out. So of course, you feel bad for them, and you really want them to be reunited. And it is such a beautiful story. It really is. I really love the Odyssey. If you have a problem with archaic language, if you have a problem with epic poems, the way they're written, there are different versions of it with more modern English, and those would probably be more suitable for you. But if you want to take a challenge where you want to read something older and see if you can get into it, then just pick up the older versions and see if you like it. If not, like I said, you can read the modern versions and it works too. It's all about the story, and that's fine. I've read the modern versions as well, and I've enjoyed those too. So definitely check out the Odyssey. It's one of the greatest stories ever. And yeah, thank you so much. Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed Christian's review on this book. Now, the Odyssey has had a huge influence on Western culture. I mean, the very word Odyssey is a word that's in our vernacular. Like, people use that word constantly to refer to a long and treacherous journey, and that word comes from this poem. And you could argue that so many modern fantasy novels and fantasy movies owe something to the Odyssey. Like, you could argue that Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, or Stephen King's Dark Tower novels, or George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones, or even the Star Wars movies owe something to the Odyssey and Homer. Now, before I talk about the official adaptations of the Odyssey, I do want to talk about other works of literature that were inspired by this story. Now, this book was written centuries later, but both the Odyssey and the Iliad had a huge influence on the epic poem The Aeneid by Virgil. And the Aeneid and Virgil's writing in general also had a huge influence on 14th century Italian poet Dante Alighieri, to a point where Virgil is a character in his most famous work, The Divine Comedy. But Homer was also clearly an influence on Dante, because both Homer and Odysseus show up in the Inferno, which is part 1 of the Divine Comedy. And also, the scene from the Odyssey of Odysseus journeying into Hades was also clearly an influence on Dante's Inferno. Charles Lamb wrote a children's version of the Odyssey called The Adventures of Ulysses in 1808. Ulysses is another name for Odysseus. You also had the 1922 James Joyce novel Ulysses, which was sort of a modern parallel of the Odyssey. Nikos Kazantzakis, who wrote The Last Temptation of Christ, and Zorba the Greek did his own version of the Odyssey in 1953 called The Odyssey, a Modern Sequel. There was a 2005 Margaret Atwood novel called The Penelopeid, which was a retelling of the Odyssey but told from Penelope's point of view, and from the point of view of the slave maids that Odysseus had executed. There have also been comic book and graphic novel adaptations of the Odyssey as well. Now, the oldest film adaptation of the Odyssey, at least that I'm aware of, is the 1954 film Ulysses, which I think was an American and Italian co-production. Now, the film was directed by Mario Cambronini. I'm not sure if I'm saying the director's last name right, but the cinematography for the film was actually done by Mario Bava, who would go on to become a huge name in Italian horror, and Mario Bava also co-directed the Cyclops sequence of the film. Now, the film starred Kirk Douglas as Ulysses, or Odysseus, and it also starred Anthony Quinn as Antinous. Now, I haven't seen the movie since I was a teenager, but I remember really liking it. There was a mini-series adaptation of the Odyssey in 1968, which was also co-directed by Mario Bava. And then, of course, you have 2001 A Space Odyssey, which I know is not actually an adaptation of the Odyssey, but again, the word Odyssey comes from this poem. There was an anime series in 1981 called Ulysses 31, which was sort of a futuristic sci-fi take on the Odyssey. There was a 1989 adaptation called Nostos the Return, and there was also a 1995 film called Ulysses Gaze with Harvey Keitel that I think was sort of a loose adaptation of the Odyssey, but it was set in the early 20th century. There was another miniseries adaptation of the Odyssey in 1997, and then the Coen brothers film Oh Brother, Where Art Thou is a very, very loose adaptation of the Odyssey, but updated to Great Depression era America. And there have been various different plays based on the Odyssey. And on top of all that, the book that the Odyssey is a sequel to, the Iliad, also had several film adaptations, like 1911's The Fall of Troy, 1956's Helen of Troy, 1962's Fury of Achilles, the 2003 miniseries Helen of Troy, and the 2004 film Troy with Brad Pitt and Orlando Bloom. Now, I'm sure there are other adaptations of both the Odyssey and the Iliad that I'm probably skipping over, but that was my review on the Odyssey by Homer, and bye.